From the very beginning of a man's life, he is shaped by stories, some told explicitly, others whispered quietly through family dynamics, social cues, and cultural rituals. Many boys grow up learning, sometimes without words, that their value lies in how useful they are to others. They notice the smiles they receive when they behave, when they share, when they are helpful. They internalize that affection comes as a reward for compliance, not as a recognition of their inherent selfhood. This is the first seed of the pleaser archetype. It is not born out of weakness, but out of survival, out of a young boy's yearning to be seen, to be loved, to be enough. As they grow older, these boys turn into men who continue to translate intimacy as performance. They are taught, often indirectly, that masculinity is not about owning one's inner world, but about being dependable, strong, and selfless to the point of self-erasure. A man who gives without asking, who bends without resistance, who prioritizes others before himself, he is praised as noble, but beneath this nobility lies a dangerous pattern. A man who pleases too quickly is often a man who fears rejection too deeply. When these men step into romantic dynamics, the same scripts continue to play. They learn to prioritize a woman's needs above their own, believing that love is earned, not given. They become the man who plans everything around her comfort, who silences his own desires to avoid conflict, who anticipates her moods before she even names them. On the surface, it appears generous, romantic, even chivalrous. But beneath it lies a hidden plea. If I give you enough of myself, maybe you won't leave me. The act of pleasing then is less about generosity and more about fear, fear of abandonment, fear of inadequacy, fear of not being enough on his own. Culturally, we have reinforced this behavior by feeding men the story that women are the gatekeepers of love and intimacy. A man must prove himself, win her approval, court her endlessly, and secure her attention before he is allowed access to closeness. What happens then is subtle but profound. His self-worth becomes externalized. He looks to her gaze to confirm his value, to her smile to reassure his masculinity, to her approval to validate his identity. And once a man builds his foundation on another's response, he loses his inner anchor. The paradox is that while men believe pleasing will make them more desirable, it often has the opposite effect. A man who only seeks to please can come across as unrooted, lacking a sense of self. Women may enjoy the attention at first, but over time they feel the imbalance. Attraction thrives on polarity, on the dance between two individuals who each hold their ground. When one person consistently dissolves into the other's needs, desire weakens, respect diminishes, and the relationship loses its depth. So the real question becomes, why do men confuse pleasing with loving? Because for many that was the earliest model of love they were given. And yet, real love requires more than service. It requires presence, authenticity, and a willingness to show up fully, with both strength and vulnerability. The roots of male-pleasing behavior are not shameful. They are deeply human. They come from a place of longing and a hunger for connection. But the work of maturity is to recognize when these roots no longer serve us. To understand that pleasing may have been the way we survived love as children, but it is not the way we can thrive in love as adults. A man must learn to step into relationships not as a performer, but as a partner, not asking, what must I do to be loved? But rather, how can I love while remaining true to myself? Because when a man releases the need to please in order to secure connection, he discovers something far more powerful, that love is not a transaction, but a meeting of equals. And that is the moment a man stops being a pleaser and begins being fully alive in his relationships. Closing thought, the roots of pleasing run deep, but so does the capacity to grow beyond them. To love without losing yourself, that is the real gift you can offer both to yourself and to the woman who chooses to walk beside you. If the roots of male-pleasing behavior come from early conditioning, then what sustains it into adulthood is the confusion between sacrifice and intimacy. Too many men mistake self-erasure for closeness. They believe that the more they give up, the more desirable they will become. They confuse disappearing into someone else's needs with being loved by them. But intimacy is not born in submission. It is born in presence. And there is a crucial difference between generosity and self-abandonment. You can give without losing yourself. You can care deeply without turning your care into a form of currency. Yet many men carry the belief that love is something transactional, that if I anticipate her needs before she speaks them, if I bend over backward to ensure her happiness, then I will be rewarded with affection, loyalty, maybe even admiration. But what happens when affection doesn't come? What happens when she takes the gift but does not reciprocate it in the way he expected? He feels betrayed. He feels used. And yet, he cannot see that it was not love he was giving in the first place, but negotiation. The psychology of the pleaser is fueled by an invisible bargain. I give you my everything so that you cannot reject me. This is not generosity, it is fear dressed as devotion. And fear corrodes desire. Because what women are drawn to is not a man who dissolves himself to fit her expectations, but a man who stands in the fullness of who he is and chooses to share from that place of abundance. When you give from fullness, it feels expansive. When you give from emptiness, it feels suffocating. What complicates this is that society has romanticized sacrifice. Men are praised for giving up their dreams, their needs, their boundaries in the name of love. We call it chivalry, commitment, devotion. But look closely and you will see that constant sacrifice does not create intimacy. It creates imbalance. It creates a relationship where one partner is endlessly fed while the other starves silently, smiling through the hunger. Over time, resentment builds. And resentment is a slow poison that destroys the very connection men were trying so hard to preserve. The deeper truth is this: intimacy requires two people who show up fully, not one person disappearing into the other. Not one person acting as the perpetual caretaker while the other becomes the perpetual receiver. Love, when it is real, thrives not in the absence of self, but in the presence of two selves who dare to meet honestly. So the task is not to stop giving, but to give differently. To give without expectation. To give from a place of authenticity rather than obligation. To say, this is who I am, and this is what I want to share with you. Instead of, this is what I think you need me to be so that you won't leave me. That shift is subtle but revolutionary. When men begin to see the difference between sacrifice and intimacy, they begin to reclaim their power in relationships. They stop negotiating for affection with acts of service. They stop burying their desires under the weight of another person's comfort. They start speaking from their truth, even if it risks conflict, even if it risks disapproval. And it is precisely that willingness to risk that makes them magnetic, because nothing is more compelling than someone who is rooted in themselves. A woman cannot truly respect a man who does not respect himself, and a man who constantly sacrifices himself is not showing love. He is showing fear. Respect, attraction, intimacy, all of these are nourished when two people can stand face to face, each grounded in their own identity, and choose to intertwine without collapsing into one another. So let us be clear, love is not about disappearing. It is about being fully seen and still being chosen. That is the risk, but also the beauty. Closing thought: stop confusing sacrifice with intimacy. Real closeness does not ask you to disappear. It asks you to show up fully, courageously as yourself. One of the most revealing aspects of men who constantly please women first is how often their kindness masks an avoidance of conflict. On the surface, it looks like generosity, being agreeable, attentive, quick to compromise. But beneath that, there is often a deep discomfort with confrontation, with setting boundaries, with saying no. For many men, saying no feels like a betrayal. They fear it will make them unlovable, unwanted, or worse, abandoned. And so they learn to equate harmony with silence, compliance with love. But the truth is, intimacy cannot exist without friction. It cannot deepen without difference. When a man erases every edge of himself in order to keep the peace, he may succeed in creating a calm surface. But underneath, the relationship grows shallow. A woman may enjoy the ease at first, the sense that he is attentive and agreeable. But over time, something vital goes missing. Desire does not thrive in sameness. Respect is not born from submission. Connection requires contrast. Think of it this way: attraction is sparked not when two people are identical, but when their differences create a dance. The tension, the negotiation, the back and forth, that is what keeps intimacy alive. If a man always yields, if he always bends, he removes the very tension that makes him intriguing. What remains is predictability, and predictability without depth eventually feels flat. This is why so many women will describe the men who endlessly please them as nice, but uninspiring, pleasant but unmemorable, safe but not magnetic. At the heart of this is fear, the fear of being disliked, the fear of rejection, the fear of standing one's ground. And yet, ironically, the very thing men are afraid of is the thing that would make them most attractive. A man who can risk displeasing a woman by being honest with her is a man she can trust, because she knows he is not performing for approval, he is being real. His presence carries weight because it is not for sale. This does not mean men must become harsh, domineering, or dismissive. That is simply the other extreme, and it too is rooted in insecurity. What it means is that men must learn to hold their ground with kindness, to disagree without aggression, to express their truth without apology. When a man can do that, he not only earns respect, he also creates the kind of dynamic that keeps desire alive. Because a woman is drawn to a partner who is an equal, not a shadow. We often forget that conflict is not the opposite of love. It is a necessary ingredient of it. Avoiding every disagreement does not preserve intimacy, it stifles it. When men learn to embrace the discomfort of conflict, they discover that it can actually bring them closer. That a woman is not repelled by his differences but often intrigued by them. That standing firm is not the end of connection but the beginning of real intimacy. The pleaser's path may feel safer, but it is a safety that breeds distance. The path of authenticity may feel riskier, but it is a risk that breeds respect, attraction, and genuine closeness. And in the end, that is what most men are truly seeking. Not the fleeting comfort of approval, but the deeper fulfillment of being chosen for who they are. Closing thought: stop hiding behind harmony. Real intimacy is not born from never saying no, but from daring to reveal the fullness of who you are, even when it disrupts the peace. One of the most overlooked dynamics in men who put women first is the way it erodes authenticity. When a man's instinct is always to anticipate her needs before expressing his own, he begins to edit himself out of the relationship. At first, it looks like care, it feels like attentiveness. But over time, it transforms into a kind of self-erasure, where his true feelings, desires, and frustrations remain unspoken. He learns to perform a version of himself that is palatable, agreeable, non-disruptive. And yet, what gets lost in the process is the rawness of his truth. The very thing that makes him feel alive, the very thing that makes him compelling. Authenticity is magnetic because it signals confidence. It tells the world, I trust that I am enough as I am. But when a man hides behind constant pleasing, what he's really communicating, though unconsciously, is the opposite. I don't believe my unfiltered self will be accepted. That insecurity is not only felt, it is transmitted. A woman may not articulate it, but she senses when a man is editing himself, when he is curating his behavior to secure approval. And nothing kills attraction faster than the feeling that the person in front of you is performing. The paradox is that many men believe that by suppressing their own needs, they are creating stability, ensuring closeness. But suppression is not the same as stability, it is simply postponement. Whatever is buried, whether resentment, frustration, or unfulfilled desire, eventually finds its way to the surface. Sometimes it leaks out in passive-aggressive remarks. Sometimes it builds into explosive anger. Sometimes it takes the form of withdrawal and emotional distance. But it always shows up. And when it does, it erodes the very connection he worked so hard to protect. True intimacy requires that both people be fully present with their edges intact. A woman cannot truly know you if all she sees is a curated version. She may appreciate the comfort, the ease, but she cannot connect deeply to what is not real. And this is where many relationships quietly collapse, not in a dramatic rupture, but in a slow suffocation, where one person feels increasingly unseen because the other has disappeared behind the mask of the pleaser. There is a deeper psychological cost as well. When men consistently neglect their authenticity in order to please, they begin to experience a quiet alienation from themselves. They no longer know where their desires end and their partners begin. Their sense of self becomes entangled in the project of managing someone else's feelings. And this dependency, though disguised as devotion, breeds resentment on both sides. The man resents her for expecting so much, while she resents him for not bringing more of himself into the relationship. What we must understand is that authenticity is not selfishness. It is not about disregarding the other person. It is about showing up fully with both generosity and honesty. A man who can say, this is what I feel, this is what I want, this is what matters to me, is not diminishing his partner. He is inviting her into a relationship with the real him. And paradoxically, it is that courage, the willingness to be seen even at the risk of disapproval, that creates the deepest sense of safety. Because safety is not the absence of conflict, it is the presence of truth. So the invitation for men is this: stop confusing pleasing with loving. Love is not the act of disappearing to keep her comfortable. Love is the act of revealing yourself, even when it disrupts the comfort, because in that disruption lies the possibility of real intimacy. Closing thought: to please at the cost of your authenticity is not an act of love. It is an act of fear, and fear cannot sustain intimacy. Only truth can. There's another layer to this pattern of pleasing that often goes unnoticed: the erosion of polarity. Polarity is the natural tension between two people that keeps a relationship charged, alive, and dynamic. It is not about conflict, but about the dance of difference. When a man consistently prioritizes a woman's needs over his own, when he gives up his position in order to remain agreeable, what begins to fade is that essential spark. The relationship becomes comfortable, but it also becomes flat. It loses the friction that makes desire possible. Desire does not thrive in sameness. It thrives in the space between two people, in the recognition that you are separate, distinct, and therefore intriguing. When a man collapses his identity into hers, when his world revolves entirely around her moods, her wants, her approval, he unintentionally blurs that necessary distance. She may appreciate his devotion, but she does not feel drawn to it. She does not feel ignited by someone who orbits her so closely that he no longer possesses a gravitational pull of his own. This is why so many men feel blindsided when, after years of pleasing, they are told, "I don't feel the spark anymore." They gave everything, yet it wasn't enough. But the truth is, it wasn't the giving itself that was the problem. It was the absence of self in the giving. He was so consumed with protecting the relationship that he forgot to inhabit it fully. And a relationship without polarity, without contrast, becomes less of a romance and more of a caretaking arrangement. The irony here is profound. Many men believe that by prioritizing a woman endlessly, they are proving their love. Yet in reality, they are dismantling the very conditions in which love and desire flourish. Because love needs closeness, but desire needs distance. Love wants familiarity, but desire needs unpredictability. And when a man's entire identity becomes consumed by the role of the pleaser, he erases the very qualities that first attracted her: his individuality, his boldness, his refusal to shrink. The psychology underneath this is fear. Fear of rejection, fear of abandonment, fear that being too much of himself will cost him love. So instead of asserting his boundaries, he softens them. Instead of expressing his own needs, he suppresses them. Instead of standing tall in his difference, he collapses into sameness. And though it may preserve harmony in the short term, in the long term it suffocates passion. What's required is not a rejection of care or generosity. Those are essential. What's required is balance. A man who can say yes with love must also be able to say no with conviction. A man who can give must also be willing to receive. A man who values connection must also preserve his autonomy. Because it is autonomy, the sense that you are your own person, with your own spine, your own values, your own desires, that keeps polarity alive. When a man reclaims his individuality, something shifts. He no longer seeks constant reassurance because he carries his own center of gravity. He no longer fears her disapproval because he understands that disagreement is not the end of connection. And in that strength, in that groundedness, she feels a renewed attraction. Not because he is trying to impress her, not because he is bending over backward to please, but because he is fully inhabiting himself. This is the paradox. The more you abandon yourself to secure love, the more elusive love becomes. The more you inhabit yourself unapologetically, the more magnetic you become. A woman may test you, she may resist you, but deep down, she longs for the presence of a man who does not disappear into her, but who stands beside her, equal, distinct, alive. Closing thought: stop erasing yourself in the name of devotion. Real attraction is not born from sacrifice, but from presence. The presence of two whole individuals daring to remain themselves in the space between. There comes a moment when men who have lived as pleasers finally recognize the cost of their patterns. They see how much of themselves has been surrendered, how often they traded authenticity for approval. And it's here that the real work begins: the reclaiming of self. Because the ultimate truth is this: when you live to please others, you silence the very essence that makes you compelling. You become palatable, but no longer powerful. You are present, but not alive. And relationships, no matter how kind or supportive, cannot thrive on half a person. Reclaiming yourself is not about swinging to the opposite extreme, becoming selfish or detached. It's not about withdrawing love to prove independence. It's about learning to embody both care and boundaries, devotion and autonomy, connection and individuality. It's about realizing that your worth is not contingent on being agreeable or endlessly accommodating, but on being rooted in who you are. When a man discovers this, something within him straightens, his spine returns, his words carry more weight, his presence deepens. A man who reclaims himself is no longer terrified of conflict. He understands that disagreement is not a threat to intimacy, but an invitation to authenticity. He learns to speak desires without apology, to set boundaries without guilt. He becomes less concerned with whether every choice will please her and more concerned with whether his choices reflect his truth. And this shift creates a ripple. It transforms not only how he sees himself, but also how he is seen. Suddenly he is no longer invisible in his devotion. He is visible in his wholeness. Women feel this difference immediately. A man who has reclaimed himself does not beg for validation, nor does he collapse under silence. He listens, but he also asserts. He cares, but he does not contort. He becomes someone who can hold her, not because he has given up his own center, but because he stands firmly in it. And paradoxically, this makes him far more attractive. Because true magnetism arises not from endless accommodation, but from embodied presence. The psychology here is profound. When men stop seeking worth in the eyes of others, they shift from an external locus of validation to an internal one. Instead of asking, "Am I enough for her?" they begin to ask, "Am I being true to myself?" And this question is liberating. It frees them from the exhausting cycle of trying to manage her reactions, her moods, her attention. Instead, they begin to cultivate their own aliveness. They invest in passions, in friendships, in pursuits that give them energy. They stop being defined solely by their role as partners and rediscover themselves as individuals. And here lies the paradox: the more a man reclaims himself, the more space he creates for genuine connection. Because intimacy thrives when both people bring their whole selves into the relationship. Two individuals, standing firm in their own essence, can meet with greater honesty, greater vitality, and greater desire. Pleasing may win short-term approval, but wholeness sustains long-term passion. So the invitation is clear. Stop negotiating yourself away for the sake of harmony. Stop erasing your edges to become more acceptable. Reclaim your voice, your spine, your presence, not as a strategy to win her over, but as a declaration that your life, your needs, your truth matter. Closing thought: to please at the expense of yourself is to disappear slowly. To reclaim yourself is to return, not just to her, but to life itself. And when you return fully, unapologetically, you don't just attract others, you awaken yourself.